Hey guys, welcome to BrewTalk with Mr. Beer's 78th episode and installment 2 of our advanced education series. This is part 2 of where we left off last week, but today we will actually be diving into the phenols portion. So let's get started. So you may be wondering, what exactly is a phenol? You probably heard that word. Let me start off just to set the tone with a little quote from a contributor to the Journal of American Society of Brewing Chemists, C.W. Bamforth. Bamforth says, "There are few more intimidating topics in brewing science than that of phenols and polyphenols. The complexity is immense." That's not intimidating or anything, nah. Luckily, I will attempt to simplify this for you and distill it down, or maybe I should say ferment it down, into what you really need to know for the purposes of home brewing. So what is the definition of a phenol? Well, broadly, a phenol can be any of a family of organic compounds characterized by a hydroxyl group attached to a carbon atom that is part of an atomic ring. Phenols are similar to alcohols but form stronger hydrogen bonds. Thus, they are a lot more soluble in water than alcohols that have higher boiling points. So now that the technical definitions are out of the way, what do phenols in beer mean to us as brewers? To put it simply, phenols or phenolic flavors are usually described as clove-like, spicy, smoky, or in worst case scenarios, they can take on a Band-Aid or almost like burnt rubber medicinal character as well, which is fairly unpleasant. Phenolic flavors can be an innate feature of specific brewing yeasts, such as wheat yeast and other Belgian yeast varieties. But beyond those styles, phenolic flavors are usually considered as off if they are showing up in beers that don't typically call for their presence. Let's use the clove-like flavor that comes from Hefeweizens, for example. Wheat yeast can target a specific acid in a malt called ferulic acid into a compound called 4-vinyl, and I'm gonna murder this, I've never been good at saying this word, guaiacol. So actually, while the primary precursor for this phenol comes from the malt itself, specifically wheat malt, because it produces this in the highest concentrations as opposed to barley, which produces less, this transformation cannot occur without a yeast that is capable, through its genetics, of this chemical conversion process. This is how we're still able to brew wheat-based beers with low phenolic production. And we do that by selecting yeast less likely to catalyze that particular transformation. It's also important to remember that phenolic flavors can come from wild yeasts, either intentionally or unintentionally via unwanted infection. There is yet another way you can end up with phenolic flavors in your beer, and that is no fun at all. Enter something called a chlorophenol. What in tarnation is that, you might be asking? Well, most people do when they hear it for the first time. That is a phenol created by chlorine. Yep, the same chlorine that you might find in pool water or treated drinking water. So how does this happen? Chlorophenols occur when chlorine is present, usually from brewing water itself because it has the potential to carry the most chlorine, but sometimes it can occur from cleaners or other agents used on brewing equipment that isn't rinsed off very well. So that chlorine actually bonds itself with the low molecular weight phenols found in malts and produces that chlorophenol. This is the phenol that brings us that awful burnt Band-Aid kind of medicinal flavor that we spoke about earlier, and it is as gross as it sounds, I promise. Luckily, the risk can be eliminated by not using chlorinated brewing water or cleaners that leave chlorine residues behind. Now, I think this next part is worth mentioning for all grain brewers out there. Believe it or not, excessive phenols can also be extracted from malt during the mash and sparge programs. The phenols created through this are called polyphenols or sometimes tannins. If you're an all-grain brewer or even a partial mash brewer, you can reduce the incidence of polyphenols by simply lowering the sparge temperature below 170 degrees. And by using brewing water with a low alkalinity and or low residual alkalinity, also known as RA. If you are steeping grains and you find yourself getting that acrid, sharp, tannic finished product, try lowering your steep temperature just a little bit. And that's also kind of part of the reason why we're very specific in our instructions about our steep temperatures. This is a lot of the reason why. So basically this reduces the extraction of tannins coming from the grain husk itself. Those astringent tannins serve a really important purpose for the grain itself because they help protect the seed from fungal infection. So you may be asking yourself, is there anything positive about phenols and polyphenols outside of them tasting nice in specific beer styles? Actually, there is. According to a published scientific consensus document, studies have shown that phenols in beer and wine may actually be good for your heart. Here's a quote from the abstract. A large evidence-based review on the effects of moderate consumption of beer on human health has been conducted by an international panel of experts who reached a full consensus on the present document. Low to moderate, up to 1 drink per day in women and up to 2 in men, non-binging beer consumption reduces the risk of cardiovascular disease. In fact, the managing director of Cooper's Brewery, Dr. Tim Cooper, is a cardiologist and speaks on this fact quite often. So if you needed a good excuse to enjoy that nightly brew or two, now you have it, and you're welcome. Keep in mind, however, this only applies to beer and wine and not distilled spirits. Sorry, guys. Fortunately, science has taught us that phenols protect LDL against peroxynitrate-mediated oxidation. In short, they act as antioxidants. Yay, beer! As a side note, if you wish to learn more about the healthy aspects of phenols and polyphenols, I highly recommend checking out the work of 2 brilliant PhDs, Christy Tagney and Heather E. Rasmussen. If you go to the National Medical Library, their work is all over that thing. So yes, Christy Tagney and Heather Rasmussen, check out their work if you have more questions about that. All that being said, there are too many individual phenols to name and characterize all of them here and now. But this should tell you basically what you need to know for the purposes of brewing your own delicious beer and recognizing these phenolic characteristics in the beer that you drink in general. All right, guys, that about wraps it up for today. Thank you for hanging out with me again and nerding out with me on my favorite subject, which is beer. Please join us next week for our next episode of Brew Talk with Mr. Beer with Robert. Have a great day, guys, and happy brewing.